How do you start a movie? It's a pretty obvious question, but it's also one that is really, well, quite hard to answer. One thing, however, is certainly clear. It is a beginning's job to establish elements of your story. Take Lord of War, for example, a film with a fantastic opening. And I'm not talking about the sequence that shows the life of a bullet. Don't get me wrong, it's a good sequence. But the thing I like most about this film's opening is the very first line of dialogue.
There are over 550 million firearms in worldwide circulation. That's one firearm for every 12 people on the planet. The only question is, how do we arm the other 11?
This one line of dialogue is up there with some of the best opening lines ever said. In just this one line, we have learned so much about this movie. It's told us the protagonist is an arms dealer who wants to sell more weapons. It's told us this film will deal with the morality of the arms industry, and it does a fantastic job at telling us about his character, and it does so in a very entertaining way. He lures us in, tells us a chilling fact about how many guns are out there in the world, masquerading somewhat like a charity commercial, trying to get us to feel terrible about that fact before they say the number is way too high, and then he slaps us in the face and defies our expectations and says in his opinion it is a terrible number because it just is not enough, and he wants everyone to own a gun, and we can infer it's because he wants to earn more money. This tells us that our protagonist has a screwed up moral code and cares more about making money than he does about the lives of his fellow human beings. Not to mention, all of that information is in just one line of dialogue. Not to mention, it is such an interesting and entertaining line of dialogue to listen to, too. And we can go even more extreme. Why even have dialogue at all, when you could do something as simple as use the title cards? Take The Shining, for example. The opening credits tell us nothing about the story. They tell us nothing about the characters. But when that music plays as the camera looks down at that lonely car on the road in that valley below, the viewer can't help but feel a cold chill, and that this movie most certainly is not going to have a happy ending. The opening credits for The Shining do a fantastic job at introducing that story's tone. Or we can go even more extreme. Why even have a camera shot at all? Take Monty Python's Holy Grail, for example. Before any camera footage even rolls, we already have a very clear sense as to what kind of movie this is gonna be, where they list people's names and do it normally, but at the bottom they have Swedish subtitles which progressively go more and more absurd, saying how someone they once knew got bitten by a moose, and where the disclaimer at the start is signed by Richard M. Nixon, and then it devolves into Mexicans whooping in a seizure-inducing sequence before revealing the actual first shot of the film, showing that it is set in medieval England, forming this total non sequitur, which does a fantastic job at telling the viewer that this is going to be a borderline insane absurd comedy. Establishing elements of the story really is the purpose openings have to serve, and the difference between a great and awful opening depends mostly on how well they pull that off. So a terrible opening will be one that gets across that information, but they do it in a thoroughly uncompelling way. The most obvious example of this would be the voiceover, where instead of using creative shots and symbolism and well-crafted dialogue, what do they have? They simply have a character address the audience directly and tell them what the film will be about.
Emojis. Here, each of us does one thing, and we have to nail it every time.
Now, firstly, I apologise for showing footage of the Emoji Movie on this channel, but secondly, this right here, this kind of example, really is the most obvious example of lazy filmmaking that you could ever hope to find, where there is no creativity applied, there are no interesting twists and turns, no characters revealed, it is merely an info dump and is about as compelling as reading a Wikipedia article. Now, it's one thing to point and laugh at all the poorly done openings out there, so let's look at one that, in my opinion, is really well done. Now, there are many fantastic examples to choose from, but I think a great example, or set of examples to prove my point, are the openings to all three installments in the Dark Knight trilogy. When we look at the opening for Batman Begins, it tells us all about Bruce Wayne's character. The first scene is him as a kid, and the second is him as a grown adult, but the entire focus of the opening scenes is on Bruce Wayne's character, which is very fitting, as the entire film is all about his character as it grows and becomes Batman. But when you look at the Dark Knight opening, that's when things really start to get quite interesting. Now first off, the opening bank heist to the Dark Knight is a thoroughly entertaining scene, but what more, it does a fantastic job at establishing a vital element of that film: the Joker, and who he is. In the first lines of the movie, the characters talk about the Joker, building this anticipation for his reveal, and as the scene goes along, we see one by one how he kills his entire crew. The entire first scene, sure, it establishes the tone, sure, it entertains the audience and grabs their attention, but it also serves one master purpose: to introduce the Joker to the audience. And what more, when we look at The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan does the exact same thing again. He has an entertaining scene which sure establishes the tone and sure entertains the audience, but it all serves the master purpose of introducing us to Bane's character. And what is really quite curious is how at no point in these two first scenes is Batman ever mentioned. Not a single second of the opening scenes of The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Rises is spent on the protagonist, because why should it? The purpose of any good opening scene is to establish elements of that story, and what is the point in establishing the protagonist when the audience already knows everything about him because he was in the prior movie? Now, if there's something I've learned while writing and learning about this craft, is that rules can always be broken. There are no absolute requirements that you have to adhere to, and when it comes to openings, the same applies. What a lot of people will tell you is that you have to get right into your main story straight away. You can't waste any time, and you have to start your main story immediately. That's a total myth, and there are dozens of really good examples out there to prove that point. But in order to realise why, let's look at Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So let me ask you, with Indiana Jones 1, when does the main story start? It's right here, isn't it? He goes into the jungle, and there's that iconic scene where he goes into the Aztec tomb and takes the gold idol and then runs from the locals, right? Well, what if I told you that this isn't the start of the story? Rather, the start of the story is here. The scene after that one, where he is a professor at his university. This university scene takes place a full 13 minutes after the start of the movie. Then someone comes up to him and gives him a quest, and then that is the starting point for the story. When you take a step back and look at it, the first scene of Indiana Jones is actually entirely irrelevant to the story that takes place in the rest of the film. Sure, it does establish the hero's personality, and sure, one of the villains too, but if you were to cut out that first scene and leave it on the cutting room floor, the movie would still make perfect sense, and it would be a worse movie for it. Now, for those of you out there who follow my channel for a while, you'll probably remember that a while back I criticised the film King Arthur and the Legend of the Sword for having so many redundant scenes. And I said in that video that if you can remove a scene and the story will still make perfect sense, then you should. And this is a wonderful example to prove why you should never listen to me. No, it's a wonderful example to prove why you should never be afraid to break the rules. And this opening, I suppose you could call it a short movie before the proper movie even begins, is actually fulfilling a very important purpose. And this is a really common technique we see in cinema. Indiana Jones, Star Wars A New Hope, Kingsman 1, Scream, The Matrix, The Dark Knight Rises, and also you could say that Game of Thrones starts this way as well. All of these movies have short stories before the proper movie really begins. Once the first scene is over, they will then cut to the protagonist, which is the point where the proper story actually starts, and which is the point which is traditionally played right after the opening titles. And on the surface level, this makes no sense, because this short story, it's redundant. It is quite usually an entirely separate story that has minimal or no effect on the main one. The main reason why this technique, by going back to look at Indiana Jones, works so well is it tells the viewer exactly what kind of story it is going to be. It is going to be us following this archaeologist as he goes on an action adventure to find ancient artifacts, and it tells us that pretty flawlessly. However, if instead the opening scene were this one, of Indiana teaching a class about archaeology, sure, the story would still make sense, but first impressions are everything, and if a viewer saw this scene, they would be quite excused for thinking the film is a thriller about a university lecturer that takes place inside his university, or maybe even a love story between a teacher and his student, which is a far cry from what the film is actually about. And for those people who assume that, when he then goes to Cairo and then goes on wacky chases in an action-adventure, it would come across as almost a shock, because it is totally different from what the opening promised the movie would be about. Again, you see this exact same device used in The Matrix. We see Trinity have an escape from some agents in a thrilling chase, but it doesn't actually add anything to the main story. It just serves as a wonderful way to tell the viewer what kind of story it is going to be about, because if the opening scene were not Trinity fighting the police, and were instead Neo in his apartment, the viewer could quite easily come to an entirely wrong interpretation as to what the movie will be about. Also, what's quite interesting to note is how the opening of The Matrix breaks one of the most fundamental rules of a beginning. A beginning is supposed to provide exposition, but part of the reason the opening of The Matrix is so interesting is because it does the precise opposite. It very intentionally doesn't tell you what's going on, or who the agents are, or who Trinity is, or what is The Matrix. It establishes questions, like how does this woman and this man have superpowers, but does not answer them. This all comes back to the idea that there are no absolute rules for storytelling, as sometimes you can break them, even the most fundamental ones, and the story will become better for it. And I think to find an example of a movie opening that ticks all of the boxes, one that is pitch perfect in how it establishes what the film will be about and provides fantastic entertainment value, well, I don't think there is a better example anywhere in cinema than the opening scene of Logan. Now, it honestly saddens me that this film didn't receive any Oscars or BAFTAs, or any real love from the mainstream awards, as for many people, including myself, it was their best film of 2017. But when I was sitting in the cinema, I remember the shock from the audience as this scene played out for the first time. There were people gasping and slapping their hands over their mouths because they were so surprised by it. All the prior movies, Logan has been this spry, capable superhero who would risk his life to save another's, and in this, he is stumbling around, barely able to stand up straight. His fighting is sloppy, he's old and grey, and is killing people in a way that leaves nothing to the imagination, which is something we've simply never had before as an audience. And in this scene, he isn't protecting some innocent girl or fighting for some noble cause. Instead, he is fighting for them to not damage his car. In this opening scene, our previous image we held in our heads about who Logan was is shattered, and right from the start, Mangold does a fantastic job at telling us this film is nothing like the previous films were, because this film is so much darker. And when it comes to how the opening of Logan does that, how it tells the viewer the film will be brutal and alien to the prior ones, Mangold did a flawless job. The word I'm about to use, I hate to use, especially when it comes to something as subjective as storytelling, but I think in this case it's warranted. The opening to the movie Logan is perfect. It tells us so much about how far our hero has fallen, to being a tired, old, morally corrupt man. It tells us so much about the tone and what the movie will be about, and more than that, delivers all of that exposition in such a potent way that it makes any first-time viewer visibly contort their body as they react to the brutal deaths. The editing is also perfect, as in the prior films there were these beautiful orchestral swells, and throughout this entire scene the only music is the muffled beats from the Mexican's van as they all get stabbed in the head. The opening scene of Logan is like the filmmaker grabbing a sledgehammer and then smashing us right in the face with it, saying, "Get ready, you're in for one hell of a ride." Now, when it comes to opening a story and writing in general, it can be really hard. And what makes it even harder is when you don't have the proper knowledge on all those vital techniques and formulas out there. I mean, what good is a blacksmith oozing with potential talent if he doesn't know how to use his own tools in the first place? Now, I know a lot of you guys who watch this channel want to write your own stories and make your own movies, so that is why I am nothing short of ecstatic to announce that today I have teamed up with the folks at Skillshare and have just released my first ever course on creative writing. In this 40-minute course, I delve deep into the topic of how to write a great character for fiction, in which I give out a ton of tips I've learned over the years on making characters, fleshing them out, character arcs, writing great villains, and generally every topic around writing great characters that I could think of. Honestly, I've put a ton of advice into this course, and I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. Now, some of the tips I do give out in this course you've seen in some of these videos, but the overwhelming amount of advice I give is stuff I've never said to anyone before. So if you watch this course, there will be a huge amount of fresh tips on the craft for you to learn from. And what really is the icing on the cake here is you can watch this course totally for free. If you want to watch it, all you have to do is click that link in the description and start a free trial with Skillshare. A standard membership usually begins for $10 a month. However, if you click that link, you will not only get to watch my course totally for free, but you will also for a full 2 months be able to binge out on every single creative writing course they have in their massive library, many of which I've watched myself and have found quite useful. And their courses aren't just limited to creative writing. They have over 22,000 courses on video editing, business management, graphic design, and everything in between. So please, if you're interested in watching my course for writing great characters, please click that link in the description and start your free trial today. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time on The Closer Look.